I was interviewed by the Chicago Manual of Style. One of the questions in this email interview mispunctuated its.
Wait. They did?
They did. Gotcha.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming for the Appel Salon at the Toronto Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening for an evening about words. Harvard psychologist and best-selling author Steven Pinker joins us to discuss the sense of style, the thinking person's guide to writing in the 21st century. Joining Steven tonight is the Globe and Mail's books editor, Mark Medley, standing in for Ian Brown, who was called off to report in Ottawa in light of this week's events. And now to the program. Steven Pinker is an award-winning cognitive scientist and the lauded author of bestsellers such as The Language Instinct, Words and Rules, The Blank Slate, and The Stuff of Thought. He is the Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University and married to the writer Rebecca Goldstein. It is often asked, not usually in this salon, why is so much writing so bad? In the sense of style, Steven Pinker rethinks the usage guide for the 21st century. Lest you are inclined to approach this marvelous book as a mere reference guide, I will relieve you of the notion now. In and of itself, the sense of style is a beautiful piece of prose and one to be savored, all the while providing working wordsmiths with gems of insight, page after page. Only Steven Pinker could have written this marvelous book, says author Patricia O'Connor, and thank heaven he has. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steven Pinker.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to come to Toronto and see so many Montrealers. I'm going to read a few pages from Chapter 3 of The Sense of Style. Why is so much writing so hard to understand? Why must a typical reader struggle to follow an academic article, the fine print on a tax return, or the instructions for setting up a wireless home network? The most popular explanation I hear is the one captured in a cartoon in which a boss says to a tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." That is, opaque prose is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats and business managers insist on gibberish to cover their anatomy. Plaid-clad tech writers get their revenge on the jocks who kicked sand in their faces and the girls who turned them down for dates. Pseudo-intellectuals spout obscure verbiage to hide the fact that they have nothing to say. Academics in the softer fields dress up the trivial and obvious with the trappings of scientific sophistication, hoping to bamboozle their audiences with highfalutin gobbledygook. I have long been skeptical of the bamboozlement theory because in my experiences it does not ring true. I know many scholars who have nothing to hide and no need to impress. They do groundbreaking work on important subjects, reason well about clear ideas, and are honest, down-to-earth people, the kind you'd enjoy having a beer with. Still, their writing stinks. In explaining any human shortcoming, the first tool I reach for is Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. The kind of stupidity I have in mind has nothing to do with ignorance or low IQ. In fact, it's often the brightest and best informed who suffer the most from it. I once attended a lecture on biology addressed to a large general audience at a conference on technology, entertainment, and design. The lecture was also being filmed for distribution over the internet to millions of other laypeople. The speaker was an eminent biologist who had been invited to explain his recent breakthrough in the structure of DNA. He launched into a jargon-packed technical presentation that was geared to his fellow molecular biologists, and it was immediately apparent to everyone in the room that none of them understood a word. Apparent to everyone, that is, except the eminent biologist. When the host interrupted and asked him to explain the work more clearly, he seemed genuinely surprised and not a little annoyed. This is the kind of stupidity I'm talking about. Call it the curse of knowledge. a difficulty in imagining what it is like for someone else not to know something that you know. The cursive knowledge is the single best explanation I know of why good people write bad prose. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that her readers don't know what she knows, that they haven't mastered the patois of her guild, can't divine the missing steps that seem too obvious to mention, have no way to visualize a scene that to her is as clear as day. And so she doesn't bother to explain the jargon or spell out the logic or supply the necessary detail. How can we lift the cursive knowledge? The traditional advice, always remember the reader over your shoulder, is not as effective as you might think. The problem is that just trying harder to put yourself in someone else's shoes doesn't make you a whole lot more accurate in figuring out what that person knows. When you've learned something so well that you forget that other people may not know it, you also forget to check whether they know it. Several studies have shown that people are not easily disabused of their cursive knowledge, even when they are told to keep the reader in mind, to remember what it was like to learn something, or to ignore what they know. But imagining the reader over your shoulder is a start, so for what it's worth, hey, I'm talking to you. Your readers know a lot less about your subject than you think they do, and unless you keep track of what you know that they don't, you are guaranteed to confuse them. As writers, then, we should try to get into our readers' heads and be mindful of how easy it is to fall back on parochial jargon and private abstractions, but these efforts can take us only so far. None of us has, and few of us would want, a power of clairvoyance that would expose to us everyone else's private thoughts. To escape the cursive knowledge, we have to go beyond our own powers of divination. We have to close the loop, as the engineers say, and get a feedback signal from the world of readers. That is, show a draft to some people who are similar to our intended audience and find out whether they can follow it. This sounds banal, but is in fact profound. Social psychologists have found that we are overconfident, sometimes to the point of delusion, about our ability to infer what other people think, even the people who are closest to us. Only when we ask those people do we discover that what's obvious to us isn't obvious to them. Another way to escape the cursive knowledge is to show a draft to yourself, ideally after enough time has passed that the text is no longer familiar. If you are like me, you will find yourself thinking, what did I mean by that? Or how does this follow? Or all too often, who wrote this crap? I am told that there are writers who can tap out a coherent essay in a single pass, at most checking for typos and touching up the punctuation before sending it off for publication. You are probably not one of them. Most writers polish draft after draft. Too many things have to go right in a passage of writing for most mortals to get them all the first time. It's hard enough to formulate a thought that is interesting and true. Only after laying a semblance of it on the page can a writer free up the cognitive resources needed to make the sentence grammatical, graceful, and most important, transparent to the reader. The form in which thoughts occur to a writer is rarely the same as the form in which they are best absorbed by a reader. Much advice on writing has the tone of moral counsel, as if being a good writer will make you a better person. Unfortunately for cosmic justice, many gifted writers are scoundrels, and many inept ones are the salt of the earth. But the imperative to overcome the cursive knowledge may be the bit of writerly advice that comes closest to being sound moral advice. Always try to lift yourself out of your parochial mindset and find out how other people think and feel. It may not make you a better person in all spheres of life, but it will be a source of continuing kindness to your readers. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And now let me introduce our host for this evening, the Globe and Mail's books editor, Mark Medley. Prior to joining the Globe, Mark was the National Post book editor, overseeing the book blog The Afterword. He has interviewed and profiled many of the world's foremost authors, including Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood, Jonathan Franzen, and Martin Amis. His work appears in publications including The Globe, Toronto Life, and The Walrus. He is a former director of PEN Canada and serves on the advisory committee for the Humber School of Writers. Apropos that we have a books editor in conversation with a linguist on the subject of writing. Please join me in welcoming Mark Medley.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? No? Testing. Is that better? Yes? Okay. First off, thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. You don't understand how lovely it is to see a full room on a Friday night, considering everything else that goes on in this city. So thank you very much for coming out. And thank you, Stephen, for coming to Toronto. I know you've been on tour for the last 6 weeks, is it?
Something like that, yeah.
So my first question is this. Earlier this afternoon, I went on Amazon and I basically searched writing guides. And over 93,000 results came up. Yours, I have to say, this isn't a lie. Yours was the first one that came up, though. So my question is this. Why did you want to write one yourself, considering so many already exist in the world?
Yeah. Well, what I think of as my comparative advantage is that it's the only writing guide that I know of that's explicitly motivated by the science and scholarship of language. That is, by all of the discoveries we've made about language through linguistic theory, through which I think provide better analyses of the grammar of English than the old guides that were basically based on old Latin books. Research from cognitive psychology on what makes a sentence easy or hard to understand. And just the critical and literary studies of usage. That I'm affiliated with the American Heritage Dictionary. I'm the chair of their usage panel. And it's amazing how few usage guides even review the history of controversies over things like the split infinitive, the dangling participle. Did Shakespeare worry about split infinitives? We now know the answer, and I've tried to apply that as well. So I call it the thinking person's guide because by applying these principles, this scholarship on language, I hope to provide advice that readers could understand, that they could think through, that it wouldn't just be a list of do's and don'ts that you memorize by rote and apply robotically, but rather try to explain the principles behind how language works, how reading works, how comprehension works, how language changes, so that people could think these things through for themselves.
Now, I would imagine most people have a favorite writing guide, especially if you're a journalist like me, maybe not most people. And as I was reading this, my memory went back to my first day of journalism school, where a professor forced me and everybody in the class to go buy a copy of The Elements of Style by William Strunk and E.B. White. And throughout my decade in journalism, I kid you not, it has never been more than an arm's length away from my desk, next to my keyboard. But after reading your book, I feel I should throw it in the garbage. Tell me about that. I mean, that seems to be, for a long time, that was the standard bearer when it comes to writing guides. But it seems to be a very flawed book, or it has at least some flaws. Well, what are your opinions about that book?
Yes, and I too started with The Elements of Style. It was certainly the first writing guide that I ever read. And it is worth reading today. You can read it in an hour, and it's got a lot of good advice, like put the emphatic words of the sentence at the end, write with nouns and verbs. And their prime directive, omit needless words, which is a wonderful example of itself, because there are no needless words in that bit of advice. On the other hand, the junior member of the pair, E.B. White, was born before the turn of the century, that is, before the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of the advice is dated in two ways. It's dated because the language itself changes, and so a lot of words and constructions that were neologisms in Professor Strunk's day have since become completely unexceptionable. So you'll find advice in there like never use the verb to contact. It's new fancy jargon, and it's only pretentious business people use it. Always be more specific. Say you're going to phone someone, or you're going to meet them, or you're going to look them up. But of course, now you can also tweet them and email them and instant message them. And in any case, it's a word that earned its keep precisely because sometimes you don't care about how one person gets in touch with another. neologisms always stick in the craw of purists and traditionalists. They always think that if it wasn't a word that was around when they were learning to write, then it's an abomination. Mm-hmm. But language is always absorbing new words. Thank goodness for that. It expands our ability to express ourselves. And so you see a lot of obsolete advice from the fact that Strunk never cultivated an ear for ongoing change. But also because they wrote before there was really much of a science of language, a lot of the advice is wrong or even self-contradictory, like the subject, as a rule, should not be separated from the predicate, which is a sentence in which the subject is actually separated from the predicate. Or use the active voice. Many a tame sentence can be improved by substituting the active for the passive voice, which is advice that avoids the passive by using the passive. So they were not grammarians. Strunk was an English professor. White was a journalist and essayist, and then famous children's author, the author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. They literally did not know what they were talking about when they wrote about grammar. I mean literally in the sense they didn't really know what the technical terms meant.
So did they do a lot of damage then, considering you had generations of journalists and writers and English students treating that as the style Bible?
Yeah. I don't think they did damage in the sense that a lot of writers would be worse off not reading any style guide, including theirs, than reading it. But they did, I think, help perpetuate an attitude that there are certain rules of usage that are set in stone and have been from the beginning of time, and that if you flout them, you are making an objective error, as opposed to a more reasoned attitude towards usage, which is that usage consists of conventions. Good writing is the way good writers write. It sounds circular, but it isn't, because there are, at any given time, ways in which certain writers write. Those conventions can change over time, and that writing advice on correct and incorrect usage ought to be criticized just like any other bit of advice. There's no council of elders that ever legislates what's correct and what's incorrect. And just because someone says that's a grammatical error doesn't mean they're right. They might be wrong. And they never indicated what the real basis of rules of correct or incorrect usage were in matters such as dangling participles, split infinitives, fused participles, and other rules, which, by the way, are, I think, the least important part of good writing in any case. They are worth thinking about, but that's not where good writing begins.
Now, the subtitle of your book is The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, and 21st century is underlined on the cover. Now, this suggests then that every century needs or deserves its own style guide.
Well, there are two reasons why the little cartoon man on the cover is underlining it. One of them is that, indeed, the language does change, and 100 years from now, there will be expressions that we're familiar with that have dropped out, and vice versa, new expressions that will have come in. In fact, there's a whole kind of sport of computational linguists who go back to period pieces like Downton Abbey or Mad Men and identify all of the anachronisms, all of the figures of speech like, no-brainer and game changer, and that just didn't exist back in the 1920s or the 1960s. So the language itself changes, but more importantly, in the 21st century, we know a lot more about language than Professor Strunk did in 1918. And we can, I think, offer more reasoned, more evidence-based, more intelligent usage than the guides of the 20th century did.
Now, what have you found are the things people most often blame for bad writing in the present day? Is it the internet? Is it this oft-repeated claim that children aren't taught grammar to the same extent that they once were? Is it the scourge of email and text messaging? What, in your experience, are people complaining about most or pointing to?
The top three are digital media. It's texting and instant messaging and tweeting and email. The deliberate attempt to obfuscate, to impress, or to hide the fact that you have nothing to say, the bamboozlement theory, and that kids aren't taught to diagram sentences anymore. Those are the ones that I hear most often.
Now, I ask that because we always like to think that we're living in an era where literacy is at its lowest point, and you rightfully state bad prose has burdened readers in every era. So why do you think we're always convinced we are living in the worst era when it comes to literacy?
Right. Yes, I have a cartoon in the book of the caption is Ancient Grammar Police. And there's one guy chiseling hieroglyphics into the plinth of a sphinx, and the other guy says, "Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little birdie." I think it's a number of things. The foremost is, as you get older, you start to notice things. You yourself become a more conscientious reader and writer and speaker, and you confuse changes in yourself with changes in the world. So as you become more attentive to fine points of word meaning or subtle matters of usage, you start to spot errors more often, and you think they are more common. And this is actually a well-known psychological phenomenon called the illusion of the good old days. And no matter what people pay attention to, they think, as they pay attention to it, they think it's increasing. If you say, pay attention to, don't eat too much, carbohydrates and sugar, and then people say, well, there are more and more snacks that have sugar in them these days. And if you tell them, watch out for fats, don't eat too many fats, and they'll say, oh, there's more and more food with high fat in them. So it's that kind of illusion. Mm-hmm. Also, it's as long ago Thomas Hobbes pointed out, criticizing the present is a way of criticizing your competitors, because people compete with the living, not the dead. Mm-hmm. So if you say things used to be better, when I was a kid or even before I was a kid, what you're doing is you're kind of bad-mouthing your competitors. Mm-hmm.
I have often felt that writing is one of the most intimate things we can share with the world. Like, I think back to my wife. Often when she writes an email, she's going to go over it 2 or 3 times before hitting send, just because she's concerned what the person on the other end is going to think of what she's composed. So my question is, why do we feel so exposed when we write?
Yes. Well, we are saying something about ourselves, for sure. We're indicating how much care we take in details, and rightly or wrongly, we can be judged on that basis. I end the prologue of the book asking, why should we even care about style? And of the 3 reasons I give, one of them is that it serves as a highly conspicuous sample of your attention to detail. Now, you can't really do an audit of, at least not quickly, of how thorough a person is in the reading and research behind a bit of writing, but you can notice whether it's properly spelled and punctuated, and whether it has blatant errors of word choice or grammar. So I quote a tech executive who explains why he doesn't hire people whose applications are filled with errors of punctuation. He says, well, if it takes someone 20 years to learn how to punctuate that's not a learning curve I'm comfortable with. And I also quote a survey from OkCupid, the online dating site, where they, having done consumer research on what impresses people in a romantic profile, they note that badly worded, punctuated, and spelled profiles are a huge turnoff. One woman customer said, I don't expect flowery Jane Austen prose, but aren't you trying to put your best foot forward? Although I did not see whether that research actually differentiated the male customers looking at females and the females looking at males. And I have a feeling it matters less to men than certain other
You're going to
traits.
divide the room here.
Yeah.
So I wonder, as somebody at this point in your career who has published, countless books and even more articles, are you still hesitant when it comes to sharing your own writing?
Oh, am I nervous about it?
I'm nervous about it, exactly.
Oh, yeah. I'm because everything you write is a new sample for other people to judge you by, and so when I write especially when I write for a popular publication as opposed to an academic journal, then I still go over it multiple times to try to polish the prose.
Who is your editor?
You mean it, with...
For this book. I
Oh, for this
imagine
book,
being your
yeah.
editor would be a very tough job.
Oh, no, well, the overall editor, the executive at Penguin Books is Wendy Wolf, and she doesn't deal with sentence structure, but more with content, with overall shape, how long should it be. She'll identify a part that makes no sense, or that it's superfluous, or that's diverting the reader. But probably more to the point, I have a copy editor, Katja Rice, who I've worked with since 1983 on 7 of my 9 books. And I learned a lot from her right at the outset. She was the one who taught me everything from mechanical details, like the period or comma goes inside the quotation marks, not outside, as illogical as that is. And I
Yeah,
have
you
a
hate
discussion.
that. I don't
hate
understand
that, yes.
why you hate that so much.
Because it's illogical. Because especially if you have any, so this is the rule that says that when you have a quoted phrase at the end of a sentence, the period goes inside the quotation marks rather than outside. And the reason that's illogical is that the period ends the sentence, and the quotation marks delimit a part of the sentence. And so I compare that to Superman's famous wardrobe malfunction, in which he wears his underwear outside his pants. And anyone who is who's done computer programming, who is a linguist, who is a logician, just is driven around the bend by this typographical convention, because it makes no sense. If you get the order of delimiters wrong, the braces and brackets and parentheses and periods, then you kind of make a hash of the work. Your program will crash. Your theorem will not be provable. The Brits are much more sensible than Americans and Canadians are, because they do have logical punctuation, as does Wikipedia, by the way, which I think, because of its nerdy sensibility, insists on logic over tradition. And the source of the tradition is a little obscure. Some typesetter decided that it was ugly to have a naked period with all that white space around it, and it just looked better to have the incorrect order. So, but anyway, going back, this was a bit of a digression, as Cookie Monster would say, but me digress. Katja Rice, my copy editor, taught me that rule. She also taught me more advice that's closer to style than the mechanics of punctuation, like minimize signposting. What a lot of beginning writers do is say, well, now that I have said X, Y, and Z, it's time for me to explain to you A, B, and C, which is almost always better to delete it, because the readers spend so much time thinking about the signposts that it doesn't actually save them any effort in reading the text itself. And she also, I think, encouraged me as a writer. She said that she was very happy in my very first book, written when I was just in my 20s, that I knew the difference between to home and to hone. And so she gave me a little confidence that I had an ear for the language. And so I owe a lot to her.
Considering how strongly you feel about punctuation and quotation marks, I'm not going to ask you about your opinions on the Oxford comma.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I'm in
I feel
favor of
that
it.
just good.
Up with the Oxford comma.
Good.
New York Times, to
I
the
do
contrary,
too.
notwithstanding. I don't know about the Globe and Mail or the Post.
The Post does not use the Oxford comma, and I would always put it in,
And someone would
despite
take
the
it out?
they take it out,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
But I felt good putting it in. I asked you about how, if you're still nervous about sharing your own writing, because as a writer, I think being accused of being a bad writer is possibly the worst insult somebody can levy against you. I know when I read the comment section of my own articles, which you should never, never, never do,
Never.
but I do it anyway, if somebody disagrees with what you've written, they will constantly say, well, you're a terrible writer, or he's a terrible writer. And it stings, even though I know they're just trying to get my, they're worked up about some disagreement. It does sting. Why do you think we're so protective about being good writers? It seems to be one of those things that just everybody is expected to be able to do, so when you're accused of failing at it,
Yes,
it hurts.
right. That's right, yes. And there is a practice, which I hope you prohibit in your section, where a reviewer will pick scan the book for the worst sentence excerpt it and hold it up as an example of the quality of prose in general. A cheap trick, which I hope as editor you forbid. So why does it sting so much? Well, it's it is what you claim to be doing well. It is sometimes treated as an indication of the degree of care which you take, and in general, your attention to detail. And there is a mistaken notion that errors of usage in particular are just heinous sins against the moral and natural order, and that if you say center around instead of center on, or if you get a little number agreement wrong, then it's like saying 1 + 1 = 3. And I have a section in the book, the final chapter, where I talk about issues of usage, where I know that for one thing, a lot, as we mentioned before, a lot of rules of usage are just bogus. They should never have been there in the first place, and that is a problem with Strunk and White. Just to go back to our original discussion, that they do have a lot of utterly spurious rules. But the other is that even if you make an error, it really isn't the end of the world. And early on, I differentiate the tone of my book from many of the others, which take a very stern and censorious attitude. Like writing is an obstacle course where there are just so many ways of screwing up that you aren't even aware of, and shame on you if you do. The way I think of it is, it's just like mastering any pastime. Mistakes are part of the game. If you try to become a better cook, every once in a while you'll burn the casserole, and if you try to be a better and better photographer, you'll take a couple of shots that are out of focus, and so you learn from your mistakes and you move on.
What do you think the worst mistakes one can make in writing are? I mean, what are the worst sins for a writer?
Lack of clarity.
Yeah.
That is succumbing to the curse of knowledge and failing to take into account what your reader doesn't know.
Yeah.
I would put that way above errors of spelling, punctuation, grammar, word choice.
Okay. Now, one thing that surprised me when I read the book was you save some of your harshest criticism for, and I'm going to quote now, the purists, also known as sticklers, pedants, peeves, snobs, snoots, nitpickers, traditionalists, language police, usage nannies, grammar Nazis, and the gotcha gang. So what is wrong with this group?
Yes. They have a combination of being snooty towards others and ignoramuses themselves. That is, they will just spray venom on people who make what they consider to be errors without themselves actually going to the dictionaries and style books to find out whether they really are errors. And so while heaping scorn on other people, they quite literally don't know what they're talking about. So they'll, for example, say that you must never use, it's a heinous sin to use aggravate to mean annoy rather than worsen. Mm-hmm. Well, if you go to the dictionary, in fact, aggravate has been used to mean annoy for 300 years. Mm-hmm. And it is just not true that you may not use it to mean annoy. Great writers have been doing it for centuries. And time and again, you'll find the most abusive language aimed at writers who are, in fact, obeying the logic of English and writing the way great writers have always written. Perhaps my favorite example is the writer who I will not name, who wrote a screed in the Weekly Standard railing against radical feminists who have been forcing people to use the so-called singular they construction. As in, I give an example from Barack Obama, who said, no American should be discriminated against based on what they look like. And many purists would say that that's an error, that the plural pronoun they is being forced into agreement with the singular antecedent no American. Or a simpler example is everyone return to their seats. Is that a grammatical error? And this writer insisted that the logic of the English language was being defiled by radical feminists. He called them and I quote, language rapists. Because the they is a gender-neutral pronoun, so you don't have to say everyone return to his seat. Now, and that what we should do is, instead, we should ignore them and return to the crystalline prose of Jane Austen. Well, it just so happens that Jane Austen used the singular they construction 76 times in her novels, as in everyone began to have their vexation. And he just never, while heaping scorn and vilifying the so-called radical feminists, made two errors. One, that it was not introduced in the 1970s by radical feminists. It goes back hundreds of years. And the other is it's not a grammatical error. I mean, there are some circumstances in which one might choose to avoid it, just like one makes dozens of choices in working your way through a sentence. But it is neither ungrammatical nor an innovation, nor for that matter does it commonly serve the purpose of avoiding a gendered pronoun. Often, as I explained, you find singular they constructions in cases where it could only be male or could only be female. There are actually other reasons why the construction goes so far back in the English language.
You also accuse the purists of holding on to a myth, you call it. What is that myth?
Oh, the myth is that matters of usage are objectively correct, that either they are part of logic itself, and that to make such an error is to flout the canons of logic, or that they're stipulated by some rule governing body, like the rules of Major League Baseball. And that is that dictionary editors sit around a table once a year and they legislate on whether disinterested means bored or without a vested interest in. And I know that this is incorrect because, and I can speak with some authority because I'm chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. And the first question I asked the editors when they signed me up was, so how do you guys decide what goes in the dictionary? How do you decide what's what's right or what's wrong? And he says, well, we pay attention to the way people use words. In other words, there's no one in charge.
And that drives the purists wild. I mean,
Yes.
you compare it to the inmates running the asylum.
The lunatics are running the asylum, exactly. And there's a myth that this all began with the publication of a particular dictionary, Webster's Third International, in the early 1960s, and that before that, dictionary editors fulfilled their mandate of safeguarding the language, and that because of relativism of the 60s and the influence of academic linguists, they forfeited that mandate and started to begin a process of dumbing down, of just writing entries that pandered to the lowest common denominator. The thing is that dictionaries have always paid attention to the way people use words. For one thing, because there is no body, council of elders or rule committee for English that has the power to stipulate usage. And for the other, a dictionary is a consumer product, and if it systematically misled people, no one would have a reason to buy it. I compare it to that old Monty Python sketch of the guy who was arrested for circulating a Hungarian English phrase book that translated, can you tell me how to get to the train station as may I fondle your buttocks? And a dictionary that stipulated a meaning of a word that actually went against the way everyone understands the word would be exactly as useless.
Speaking of dictionaries, what do you think the dictionary or a dictionary in a century will look like? I mean, is this something that, besides the words contained within, will undergo some kind of radical transformation as the decades go on?
Well, the biggest transformation is one that we've already lived through, and in practice, even though I consult for a dictionary, I use it, I seldom, if ever, balance a heavy tome on my lap and go flip, 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 flip. The American Heritage Dictionary, if you do buy the doorstop, it comes with a smartphone app with identical information. And I also have a program, software version for my computer that is almost always open on my screen. Mm-hmm. But the content is the same. It's still decided on in the same way, it's just pixels instead of dead trees, and far easier to use. The content of the dictionary will continue to change, just because the language changes. The way the American Heritage Dictionary does it, and also Merriam-Webster and Encarta, is to have usage notes for controversial issues. So say, take disinterested, which the purists would insist can only mean without a vested interest or impartial, which people commonly use to mean bored or uninterested. And I think as a matter of just better style, it ought to be reserved for without a vested interest, simply because we have uninterested for bored. And it's subtly different from unbiased or impartial in a way that is useful to convey, and that fellow literate readers will sense the careful use, and they'll enjoy the sentence and appreciate you more as a writer if you do so. On the other hand, it is not technically incorrect in the sense that the original sense of disinterested was bored. That's how it was used for hundreds of years, and in fact, it has always been used simultaneously to mean either impartial or bored. It's not a recent corruption, as the untuned ears of many purists fool them into thinking. And you could look it up. It's great writers have used disinterested to mean bored all along. But in a case like that where there's no simple correct or incorrect answer, it's really a matter of discernment. Do you want to use the more precise usage or the broader one, which is not incorrect but is less precise? There'll be a little discussion of it, a usage note after the dictionary, which will say, this is the reaction you might expect. In the case of the American Heritage Dictionary, we have a panel of about 200 writers chosen from all walks of life. Sports writers and journalists and essayists and poets.
How are they chosen? Is there an application process, or do you get a mysterious telephone call late one night being like, "Come join us"?
The latter.
Oh.
Yes. I consult with the executive editor and 2 other editors, and we bat around names, and we try for some diversity of gender and race and age, but people who have shown through their writing that they take care in how they write. It's also partially marketing, so the contradiction that we face is that it has a tendency of getting older and older, because that's what people do. They get older if you just leave their name on, and which is a problem because it will reflect the language as it was spoken 50 years ago as opposed to how it's spoken now. On the other hand, young people tend not to be as well known, and if you want to say, we've got a usage panel with all of these Pulitzer Prize-winning novelists and essayists, the younger ones tend to be more obscure. So we have to kind of balance that.
Are there any rappers on the panel? Because I mean, if I was running a dictionary, I would get like Drake or Kanye West to sit on the usage panel.
Yeah.
Some of the most inventive use of language, especially stuff that filters down to teenagers, is originated in hip hop.
No, that's true, and I think though that for the purpose of the dictionary, we wouldn't necessarily want hip hop artists, but we would want the people who are co-opting hip hop terms into edited prose, which is a reason not to have people, my age, and to have some people in their 20s and 30s. And the reason is not that there's anything wrong with the language of hip hop, but just that the product of the dictionary tends not to be used by hip hop artists, but does tend to be used for writers who are writing in certain forums, namely, I mean, they're not precise boundaries, but in general, newspapers, magazines, student term papers, government documents, corporate documents. It doesn't have to be, fancy schmancy, highfalutin outlets. It can include things like, the weekend supplement of the paper or USA Today. But it is that set of genres that people use a dictionary to as a reference. And so it's the kind of language that would be expected by readers of that kind of prose that we would want to offer advice on.
Sure. Now, The Sense of Style has been out for about a month now. I wonder, since the book came out, if you've heard from any of the purists. any kind of criticism from them. I'm kind of like envisioning a gang of angry copy editors, throwing Chicago manuals of style at you. Like, have you heard from anybody who's taking issue with anything you've written?
Actually, I had a fine moment of putting the shoe on the other foot when I was interviewed by the Chicago Manual of Style. And one of the questions in this email interview mispunctuated its.
Wait. They did?
They did. Gotcha. And so I had a little fun playing purist myself. So no, I think partly, not yet. I mean, I don't doubt that it will happen. Partly because that kind of criticism was preempted in the very lengthy chapter on the fallacy of the purists. And so they themselves would have to be on the defensive in throwing that around. I did get one review from a critic who seemed to be playing the role of an old crotchety geezer, like that I was using newfangled terms like feedback, which were, and I'm telling you that this horseless carriage will never catch on. It's a passing fad. But I actually think it's actually hard for me to believe that this is a critic named Joseph Epstein writing in the Wall Street Journal. It's actually hard for me to believe that he actually thinks that, or whether he's rather than writing sincerely, he's kind of almost writing from playing the role of an old crotchety geezer, because it's hard to believe. The term feedback goes back to the 1940s, and so it's hardly a bit of neologism, a bit of jargon, I mean.
Now, we've spent most of this talk talking about bad writing, but you also provide examples of good writing in the book. You mentioned in the first couple of chapters writers like Richard Dawkins and the wonderful obituary writer Margaret Fox and your own wife, Rebecca. Just great job. So what other writers inspire jealousy in you?
Yes. And I have to mention for the inclusion of Rebecca Goldstein that this was not just nepotism, because we met each other through our writing. So we were mutual fans. It was kind of a literary romance. And so the admiration for the writing came before the marital entanglement.
Okay.
Who are there? Let's see. There are a lot. I mean, you mean contemporary writers or classic?
Yeah, I guess contemporary.
I think there's a lot of good science writing out there. I think we're really living in a golden age of science writing. So Robert Sapolsky, the primatologist, is a fine writer. E.O. Wilson, who's won, the biologist, won not one but 2 Pulitzer Prizes. A number of mathematicians are terrific writers. Stephen Strogatz, who had a column in the New York Times for a while. There's a new book called How Not to Be Wrong by Jordan Ellenberg that I think is very well written. I cite, I have an analysis of a passage by the physicist Brian Greene. Let's see, and there are lots of good essayists. Ron Rosenbaum, who writes for The Atlantic and The New Yorker. Adam Gopnik, fellow Montrealer.
We were talking about Christopher Hitchens backstage. Would you put him in that camp? Because he's one of those writers. In the excerpt you read, you talked about how sometimes people envision, these writers kind of churning out perfect copy in an hour, and he was known for doing that.
He did, although he was so prolific that some of his writing was better than other bits of his writing, and he could, in his prodigious output, there was some stuff that was clearly, as we say, mailed in, where the writing did not sing. On the other hand, when he sharpened his knife, when he pulled out the stiletto, the scimitar, there was no matching him. My favorite example being his evisceration of there's a conservative writer in England named Philip Johnson, who as seems often to happen with British celebrities, he was caught in a sex scandal that involved spanking. There was a tell-all by his mistress, and the thing is that he had a long paper trail of railing against the decline of morality and decline of family values. So it's particularly delicious when a person like that gets caught in scandal. And Hitchens, after working in an early part of the essay that a common slang term for the penis in Britain is a Johnson, and the last line of his commentary was, not even the pharmaceutical wizardry of the Pfizer Corporation can make this Johnson rise again.
I'm speechless.
Now that's enviable if you go in for that kind of rapier-like attack. Yes.
Just a few more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you want to start thinking of questions for Stephen, now might be a good time to do so. I guess my next question is, it's a two-part question. How do you define good writing? And do you think writing this book has made you a better writer?
I like to think so, but that's probably not for me to judge. What makes for good writing? It has to be defined relative to the goals of the writer. And the main part of the sense of style is directed at writers who aim for clarity and some degree of style, of fun, of aesthetic pleasure, but in large part clarity. And I differentiate different styles of writing and extol one particular genre called classic style, a term that I got from the literary scholars Mark Turner and Francis Noel Thomas, where the goal is to help the reader see reality. But there are other styles, there are other intents. There's ringing oratory, a politician rousing up a crowd, or a preacher announcing that they can see, or a prophet who can see something that no one else can see. You have stream of consciousness writing, where the intent is not to give a clear picture of reality, but rather to allow the as best as the resources of language can allow, to have a reader duplicate the consciousness of a writer. And each one of these will involve using language in different ways. And what will work with one set of authorial goals won't necessarily work in another. Mm-hmm. But I think there are certain, well, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Looking ahead again, as digital communication becomes even more prevalent, we spend more time online. How do you think language is going to change? It's not clear that it will change in any dramatic way, other than the obvious way in which language always changes. Namely, it sucks in idioms and technical vocabulary from a wide range of fields. So there are terms from sailing that have been absorbed into the mainstream, like let's take a new tack, and terms from golf and horse racing, and so there'll be terms from computer science and the internet that will be absorbed into the mainstream. But there'll be a variety of genres that did not exist before. The tweet is a new genre, the instant message. I'm often asked whether this will bleed back and change the way language is used in other media, and there's no reason to think that there is, any more than the haiku or the sonnet forced people to always write in haikus or always write in sonnets. You have a variety of formats and genres, and you perfect the style that's appropriate to each one. So just to be more concrete, during the 80s, there was a widespread transition from typewriters to word processing. My first book, I wrote out longhand with a fountain pen. My second one, I typed in a microcomputer. I don't think you could, going back to the 80s, I don't think you could sense any transition in the quality of a book based on whether the writer was a holdout for an old Smith Corona or used an IBM PC. So I don't think it'll be a dramatic one that's attributable to the technology. Did you write this one on an iPhone?
I did not write it on an iPhone, no.
I wanted to ask you about Twitter. You kind of preempted. As a linguist, what do you think of the platform? And I mean, you're on Twitter as well, so and you're on there quite often, quite regularly. I mean, I look at it, it seems to almost be an incubator of language, as from my perspective.
It could be. I was a reluctant Twitterer. I wrote an op-ed saying that digital media are not the don't signal the doom of the language and intelligent life and civilization. And so my literary agent said, well, now you've got to, kind of put your fingers where your mouth is, or whatever the expression would be, your money where your mouth is, and you've got to start tweeting. And it took me a while to get the hang of it. Most of my tweets are links to other articles. But there is, I do find it actually helpful in mastering the tricks that all of us have to master in making our prose more concise. Talk about omitting needless words. Twitter really forces you to omit needless words. And as anyone who writes for a newspaper knows, you're given X hundred words, and you got to make it fit. And this was a real adjustment after being a prolix academic, where you could just go on, and no one would ever tell you to stop. So you have to, in writing an 800-word piece for a newspaper, you've got to figure out which words, which sentences are dispensable without loss of meaning. And the exercise of fitting something into 140 characters really hones that skill.
Yet at the same time, stepping away from Twitter and looking at the internet in general, it has infinite space.
Yes, that's true. So paradoxically, well, not paradoxically, things are complicated. Yes, so you have the tweet of 140 characters, but then you also have, in things like Wikipedia, where you can have endless entries linking to other entries, and the traditional and somewhat arbitrary constraints of how heavy a volume of an encyclopedia can you balance on your lap, you no longer have to worry about.
Yeah. Final question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. In the conclusion to The Sense of Style, you talk about how grammar evokes misplaced emotion, and that's a direct quote. And then you go ahead and quote a few writers, including Lynn Truss, who wrote Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, who says, people who misuse apostrophes deserve to be struck by lightning, hacked up on the spot, and buried in an unmarked grave. Why is grammar such a divisive topic?
In her case, it's not even grammar, it's punctuation.
Punctuation, yes.
And by the way, it's almost obligatory in this genre of outrage against sins of the language to express mock desires of violence. So if you read the hacked and unmarked grave, you always say, I want to murder these people, I want to tear them limb from limb. This is the misplaced emotion. And watch out for it. Whenever you see a rant against errors in grammar, there'll always be a sarcastic, veiled expression of desire of physical violence against the perpetrators. I think it's part of it is the illusion of the good old days, and the fact that when you criticize declines, you are criticizing your rivals. When you hark back to a golden age, also writing the rules of punctuation, grammar, word choice, and so on are conventions, and they're the rules of the game. They're the things that you don't explicitly mention, but that make everything else possible. And there's always a sense of uneasiness, betrayal, anxiety when conventions are flouted. Mm-hmm. In fact, psychologists who study the moral sense note that it's very easy to moralize violations of conventions. If someone dresses differently or eats differently, we often sense it for some strange reason as immoral. And indeed, in traditional societies, nonconformists would be punished. So I think it taps into a primitive part of our moral psychology as well.
Perfect, thank you. There are microphones, I think, right in the center aisle, so we have about 20 minutes for audience questions, so don't be shy. Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you so much. You touched on this earlier when you mentioned using a fountain pen for your first book, and now you're using a computer. There's been a worry, and I have a personal worry about the death of the cursive writing script. I know there's been things about cognitive science and learning. Do you have an opinion on this?
The decline of cursive writing, yeah. as someone who always had to recopy his assignments in elementary school, and who have always had terrible handwriting, I can't get too worked up about the death of cursive. There is a trend where I think it's good to be able to write at least in block letters. So I don't think that students should no longer be taught how to write. But cursive was invented as a workaround for the fact that it is slow and laborious to write individual characters. Cursive is harder to read than block letters. That's why when you fill out a form, there are a bunch of little boxes. Because if you write in cursive as people would do if they were allowed to, the people reading the forms would often not know what they wrote. So there's a good reason, there are good arguments against cursive. And given that there are only so many hours in the day, and given that in an educational day, all the time spent on getting kids to learn cursive is time subtracted from something else, and probably the something else is more justifiable. So, I mean, I would miss it. Cursive, well-written cursive handwriting is aesthetically pretty, and maybe it'll survive the way riding horses survived the automobile as a kind of pastime. But the reason, by the way, that there actually is a reason why I think that it's still important to be able to, to master a pen and pencil. And one of them is that when you take notes, there are some studies that show in lectures that handwritten notes are more effective at remembering material than taking notes on a laptop. And I think the reason is you can more deftly use space on the page, position on the page, and non-alphanumeric indicators like lines, arrows, indentations, varying the type size, and so on, to mirror the conceptual content. And so the notes are more useful and a closer record of the thoughts than if it's just one long string of alphanumeric characters.
Thank you for the question.
Sir, about 40-odd years ago, when I was learning how to write an essay in school, there was a writer who was doing his homework, and there was his teacher, a martinet by the name of Harry Johnston, who would, point out all the errors and so on and so forth. But there were only two people. Today, when I'm writing, there are four people, if I were to write to you, for example. And the reason is that all of us have now to have what is known as the private life and the business life. When I write a business email, I'm expected to be, very short, crisp, clear. Whereas if I were to write to you as a friend, I could afford to be a little flowery, a little more descriptive, if you will. I'm sure that if Henry Fielding were alive today, he wouldn't be able to write a business letter. Right? So how do you cope with the schizophrenia? I mean, I said, how do you cope with the schizophrenia? I mean, I struggle with it every day. I mean, there is a little bit of Jane Austen and a little bit of the Tom Brown School Days that comes and interferes when I'm writing a business letter.
Yes.
You know what I mean? How do you cope with that in today's world?
Yeah, so part of being a competent writer is to tailor your prose for the medium, and it would be a waste of time to put an email about setting the time for a meeting through 6 or 7 drafts. And conversely, if you're writing something that's intended for a large number of readers of diverse background, that's going to sit on a page, say if it's an essay for a magazine or a newspaper or a review, it would also be an error to not put that through 5 or 6 drafts. And I think this has always faced writers. Their correspondence goes way back. In the first part of the 20th century, people had to cope with, actually in the 19th century, with telegrams, and that called for its own style of prose when you were paying by the word, and so you have to make it as terse as possible. And so there's a whole form of telegraphic language where you leave out the prepositions in the articles. Right. In the first decades of the 20th century, many cities would have mail delivery several times a day, quite reliably, and people used postcards the way we use email today. Right. I mean, if you go to a flea market and you flip through the antique postcards, the content on the back will say things like, sorry, can't make it for coffee at 4, let's meet at 5 today. Almost inconceivable that mail would be that reliable and that frequently delivered. But before the age of email it was, and the language of those postcards was often quite clearly written in haste, as it should have been.
Right.
And so I think it's unwise to judge the character of writing in a given era by something like instant messages or texting. One ought to be as sloppy as one can get away with as long as the message is clear in such a medium,
Yeah,
but not in
that's
other
true.
media.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm a communications manager who works at a university, so I spend a lot of my day trying to convince academicians politely that if they knew their topic well enough, they really could explain it briefly.
Yeah.
This is your life. You're a researcher, you're a professor, you're a writer, you write for the public. So what do you think are the limits to brevity when it comes to trying to convey an academic discovery to the academy and then to the public? Do they have to be separate pieces?
They, clearly complex ideas can't necessarily be boiled down to something that's arbitrarily short. But I think academics tend to underestimate the degree to which a skilled writer can explain complex material clearly and concisely. That it's a lazy excuse of a lot of academics that, oh, it's just all too complicated. I have to use jargon. I have to use opaque abstract language. And gifted writers, like Richard Dawkins, like Brian Greene, can often convey remarkably complex material in vivid and honest prose. That is not dumbed down, but with that extra effort to be clear. Part of it is the overcoming the curse of knowledge to try to reconstruct the state of a reader who is as intelligent and intellectually curious as you are, but just happens not to know what you know. So kind of overcoming that curse of knowledge. Part of it is also, especially among academics and other professionals, is to realize that there are can be two contradictory goals in writing. That when you write for your peers, you are engaged in a lot of self-presentation. You're basically trying to convince your peers that you are up to snuff with the professional standards of evaluation in your field. And so a lot of academics write defensively. They just want to make it clear that they are not naive about how hard it is to know anything about anything. And so they're never willing to say anything about anything, lest they be accused of being, cutting a methodological corner. Whereas if the other goal is to actually explain something. And we didn't talk about the sins of academies, but a lot of it consists of, as Turner and Thomas put it, trying to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about your own enterprise. And academics have to get over the terror of being judged invidiously by their peers and write for their peers in order to convey content to intelligent lay people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I had a question related to the tension between, I guess you could say, tradition and innovation. I noticed you had an ongoing theme throughout your remarks of X practice is legitimate because it was used a century ago, and that's fine. How do you balance this tension between new words are invented and they're understood and it makes sense to use them, and we can learn something from tradition as well, even though they seem to be in some tension?
Yes, they can be in some tension, and there's no hard and fast algorithm for that, like how frequent it has to be, how new. So there's a certain matter of judgment, and this is something that dictionary editors cope with. Namely, is a new word used in enough contexts, by enough writers, in enough genres, for a suitable period of time that it isn't some kind of shooting star or flash in the pan that will instantly seem dated. a writer who doesn't have access to as broad a sample as a dictionary editor would do well by consulting a dictionary for exactly this reason. And that's why I think dictionaries are useful in trying to attain that balance for the benefit of writers who themselves don't have access to the same range.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. I am going to have to be the bad guy now. We have time for 3 more. So we have time for 3 more. Stephen's going to be around afterwards, so you might have a chance to ask him in person, but 3 more, and then we're going to have to finish up. So go. Yeah, you're fine.
You talked about how annoying, or perhaps I should say aggravating, the purists can be with their insistence on certain rules of grammar and usage. And so my question is there a place for these rules? And if so, are some rules more meaningful or resonant or important than others?
Yes, yeah, there is. And so it's, I don't fall into the common dichotomy between the prescriptivists who prescribe how language should be used and the descriptivists who describe how it in fact is used and say that because some of the rules are bogus, one should blow off all the rules. There are many rules that are worth respecting. There are differences in meaning that one would be well advised to obey, otherwise one would write in malaprops. It's generally not a good idea to thank someone for their fulsome praise because fulsome is not a fancy schmancy synonym for full. It means insincere or excessive. It's good to, when there are rules that everyone agrees just apply to ordinary English, like subject-verb agreement, to pay attention to those, not to make an error like George W. Bush when he said, "Is our children learning?" Just because "is our children learning" is like saying "our children is learning." There are ways in which certain rules that make your prose for reasons that are often hard to put your finger on just sound classier and more pleasant to read. If you say, if I didn't have my seatbelt on, I'd be dead, it doesn't sound as good as if I hadn't had my seatbelt on, I'd be dead. And your prose will be more pleasant if you follow those rules. And I try to explain the rationale so that they don't seem as mystifying. The question is just not to force people to obey rules that are not rules in the first place, that are just urban legends of rules, that where no great writer has ever obeyed them. No reputable evidence-based style book has ever stipulated them, but they float around as rumors as to how one ought to write that are just kind of levitating in thin air. So the rules about aggravate, about split infinitives, about fused participles, they're just bogus rules. And the fact that you should not worry about those doesn't mean that you shouldn't worry about any rules, just you shouldn't worry about the bogus ones.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I agree with a lot of the things you said about academics and everything, but when you read academic writing for a field that is not your own, you are not the intended reader. So when you read that, how can you help but judge that writing as bad based on anything other than grammatical rules and jargon that you don't understand in general?
Mm-hmm. Well, partly, there's a lot of writing that I find bad that's written in my own field, where the writer does not have the excuse that, that he or she is writing for people who are familiar with the technical terminology. So there is some truth to the saying that not everything will necessarily be comprehensible for everyone, that it would be tedious if you had to spell out familiar terms that are common knowledge within your field. In practice, most academic writers vastly overestimate the extent to which their jargon is common knowledge. And I often find myself mystified by articles in my own field, having to read a sentence 4 or 5 times to try to figure out what the author had in mind. Also, because it's actually not a good thing to have traditional academic silos in which the biologists write only for biologists and a psychologist can't understand a word, or the psychologists exclude the sociologists. Knowledge is continuous. Academic disciplines are convenient fictions for the benefit of deans, and there are often choices that one can make in using a transparent technical term instead of an opaque one, or avoiding a needless abbreviation, just spelling it out, where you could multiply your readers 1,000-fold at the cost of like 7 characters. It is, even if in cases where it is technically true that your peers will understand what you're saying, why not have a broader audience than your subfield? It doesn't make prose any less scientific or less scientifically scholarly respectable. There's no reason for a scientist ever to use the term murine model, which means rats and mice. And there are many cases like that where I think it's the scholarly equivalent of picking up $100 bills on the sidewalk. You're 2% clearer, you multiply your audience by 10,000. And so I consider that a good to be sought.
Thank you. Now, this is going to be, once again, this is the last question, unfortunately, so no pressure, though.
When it comes to things like textlish or like texting, stuff like, when sometimes people, I see this all the time when my friends do this, and sometimes it gets on my nerves, when they don't actually type out Y-O-U, they just put in the U, and like instead of typing out later, it's L8R. What would you say this is? Would you consider it as incorrect grammar or maybe like another subset of English?
In general, I consider it a subset of English if it's used in those media. That is, so if you have, especially if you have one of those old-fashioned dumb phones where you only have the numeric keypad and you don't even have one button per letter, which are getting rarer and rarer, and that's, of course, what led to a lot of those conventions, then I think it's okay in that medium. It would not be okay in a in a paper or a movie review or an essay. But it's, there's a widespread rumor that I come across that more and more students are so oblivious to the difference that they're spelling later L8R in their college term papers. And that is a myth. That doesn't happen. In fact, it's one of these urban legends like alligators in the sewers and the hippie in the microwave and so on, where you can actually trace it to a source where this rumor originated. There was a 12-year-old Scottish girl about 10 years ago who took on the challenge of writing a paper, What I Did on My Summer Vacation, for her school. She decided to do it entirely in these texting abbreviations as a challenge to see how skillfully she could do it. I thought it was brilliant. It was witty, it was ingenious, but that led then this deliberate choice to write the essay entirely in those abbreviations. In the retelling, got mangled into, there's a student who inadvertently, not realizing that this was inappropriate, introduced a bunch of texting abbreviations, and then that got retold as all students today do that they're, but surveys of university freshman term papers have shown that that in fact does not occur. So it's all relative to the medium.
Thank you. On that note, please join me in thanking Steven Pinker.
Thank you.